Anthony Quinn's mansion in Providence, Rhode Island, had long been the subject of whispered rumors. The sprawling estate, perched on a hill overlooking the town, was a place of both grandeur and mystery. The house, built in the late 19th century, had been home to various notable figures, but it wasn't until Quinn himself took up residence that its reputation began to shift into something more eerie. Visitors often reported strange phenomena as they walked through the house, especially at night. The once bustling mansion, now quiet and seemingly abandoned except for a few staff, had an air of something being left behind, as if the past had never fully let go. But it was in the shadows that the house truly became unsettling. People described seeing dark, shifting figures along the walls, strange outlines that would grow and shrink, changing shape as if they were alive. Some claimed these shadows were linked to Quinn's own movements, but others insisted they were entirely separate figures from another time, perhaps, that had taken up residence in the very bones of the mansion. The air itself felt thick, heavy with a presence that couldn't be ignored. And then there were the whispers. At first, the sounds seemed like nothing more than the house settling, creaks in the floorboards, the wind slipping through the cracks. But as more people spent time in the mansion, they realized that these whispers had a distinct tone, a southern drawl, soft and deliberate, as if someone were speaking directly into their ears, but with no one around to speak. They were barely audible, like the words were being carried on the wind, but those who heard them couldn't shake the feeling that they were being spoken just for them. On one occasion, a housekeeper, a young woman from Rhode Island, claimed to have heard the whispers while dusting the grand staircase. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mind, but as she climbed the stairs, the voice became clearer, a deep southern accent, muttering phrases she couldn't make out. Her heart raced as she turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the long, dark corridor leading to the master bedroom. Some suggested that the voice belonged to a long-dead resident of the house, a previous owner with ties to the South. Others believed it was linked to Quinn's own personal history, as though the house was somehow echoing his life and the various personas he had portrayed throughout his storied career. The connection between the southern whispers and the shadows seemed to hint at something more profound, as though the mansion itself had become a repository for every role Quinn had ever played, haunted by his past, and by a history that refused to be forgotten. Over the years, the stories grew. The house had its share of visitors, but few stayed long enough to experience the whispers for themselves. Those who did often spoke of the strange coldness that would sweep through the halls late at night, or the way the shadows seemed to follow them as they moved through the rooms. Some even swore they could feel a presence behind them close, but just out of sight, always just beyond their reach, like a memory refusing to fade. To this day, the mansion remains a place of intrigue, a house where the past and present collide. And though Anthony Quinn himself passed away many years ago, the whispers, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched still linger in the darkened corners of the estate, as if the house itself is holding on to something that refuses to let go. As the years passed, the mansion's mystique only deepened. Rumors of strange happenings reached the ears of local historians and paranormal investigators, who were drawn to Providence, eager to uncover the secrets hidden within Anthony Quinn's estate. But despite numerous attempts, no one could pinpoint the source of the whispers or the shadows. Some said the house had become a living thing, feeding off the energy of those who entered it, drawing out forgotten memories and long-buried emotions. One evening, a renowned paranormal team set up equipment inside the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever lingered there. They placed infrared cameras in the most active rooms and set up audio recorders, hoping the whispers would make themselves known in a more tangible form. As they ventured through the long hallways, the oppressive weight of the house seemed to grow heavier, like the air itself was thick with the presence of something unseen. The team gathered in the drawing room, where the windows were covered with heavy drapes, shutting out the last light of day. It was there, in the deep silence of the house, that the first sign of something truly extraordinary occurred. A sudden, icy gust of wind swept through the room, even though all the windows were tightly sealed. The team members exchanged nervous glances, but no one said anything. They had learned long ago not to question the inexplicable. Then, through the stillness came a voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the sound of their breathing. But it grew stronger, the southern drawl unmistakable. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice heavy with an unspoken command. One of the investigators, a seasoned medium, felt a chill crawl up her spine. She felt the pull of the voice, an inexplicable desire to obey. Her fingers twitched as if reaching out toward the empty air, but she quickly pulled her hand back, fighting the compulsion. As she hesitated, the shadows in the room began to shift, growing larger against the walls. The team could see them now, unmistakably human in shape, tall, imposing figures, standing as if waiting for something. But the figures did not move. They only watched, their presence suffocating, like the weight of history pressing down on the room. The medium, despite her training, felt her heart race. "It wants us to know something," she murmured, her voice trembling. "But it's not just Anthony Quinn we're dealing with. There's more, something older." Suddenly, the whispers became louder, more urgent. They circled the room, weaving through the air like a song, with an untraceable melody that seemed to tug at something deep within each of them. "Don't leave." The voice was unmistakably Quinn's now, but there was something else in it, a crackling distortion that suggested another presence entirely. With the whisper, the temperature dropped sharply, and the team could see their breath in the air. The shadows grew darker, stretching across the room as though reaching for them, bending in unnatural angles. The door to the library creaked open on its own, the hinges groaning in protest. The investigators, drawn in by a mix of fear and fascination, slowly moved toward it. Inside, the atmosphere was thick, as though time itself had frozen. The walls were lined with old portraits, many of them faded or obscured by years of neglect. But it was one portrait that caught the team's attention. It was a painting of a woman, strikingly beautiful, but with eyes that seemed unnaturally intense. She stared directly at them, her expression frozen in time, but her gaze seemed to follow their every move. Her lips were parted, as if she had been caught mid-word, though no sound came from the canvas. The medium stepped closer to the portrait, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the frame. The moment her fingers brushed against the wood, the room seemed to shudder, as if the house itself were alive. A low growl reverberated through the air, emanating from the very walls, and the temperature plummeted to an unbearable cold. The shadows seemed to pulse, growing ever darker. One investigator, unable to take the pressure any longer, turned to flee, but as he reached the doorway, something caught his ankle. He gasped, looking down in horror to see an invisible force pulling him back into the room. The others rushed to his side, but it was as if he were stuck in a web of darkness. No one could understand what had happened. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and the room fell into an unnerving silence. The investigator was released from whatever hold had taken him, and he stumbled back into the safety of the hallway, his face pale and shaken. They left the mansion that night, but none of them would ever forget what they'd experienced. The investigators later spoke of the oppressive force in the house, a malevolent presence that seemed to be tied not only to Quinn but to the mansion itself. But they couldn't explain the portrait, the woman whose eyes followed them, or the strange growl that echoed in the walls. And as for the whispers, they never truly stopped. Rumors still circulate that, on stormy nights, the mansion can be heard from the street, whispers weaving through the trees, shadows dancing against the windows, and the faintest echo of a southern accent calling out to those brave enough to listen. The mansion remains, as always, waiting for someone to uncover its dark secrets. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Weeks passed since the paranormal investigation at Anthony Quinn's mansion, but the unsettling events had only grown more pronounced. The house, it seemed, was no longer content with subtle signs and fleeting shadows. It had begun to grow bolder, more insistent. The whispers, which had once been faint and distant, now echoed through the halls in full clarity, speaking not just to those inside, but to anyone who happened to pass by. Local residents who lived near the mansion began to notice strange occurrences in their own homes. At night, when the wind howled through the trees and the fog rolled in from the bay, some reported hearing muffled conversations that seemed to originate from the mansion, voices low and urgent, but unintelligible. Others swore they saw flickers of light moving past the windows, as though someone were walking the halls, though no one had been seen entering or leaving for days. One evening, a couple of local teenagers, drawn by the stories circulating around town, decided to venture into the mansion after dark. They knew the place had a reputation, but like so many before them, they dismissed it as superstition. The mansion loomed before them, dark and imposing, its windows like watchful eyes in the night. Armed with only flashlights and a sense of invulnerability, they crossed the overgrown yard and slipped through a side door, which creaked ominously as it opened. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with a sense of history that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, as if protesting their presence. They made their way to the drawing room, where the atmosphere felt especially tense. Their flashlights flickered momentarily, and in the dim light, they could make out the familiar shifting shadows on the walls. But these shadows were different, more defined, almost human in form. Suddenly, they heard it, a whisper, unmistakable and close, as if someone were standing right next to them. "Don't stay," it hissed, the southern drawl cutting through the air. But they dismissed it as a trick of their nerves, chalking it up to the wind or their own imagination. That is, until they heard it again, louder this time. "Leave now." Frozen in place, the two teenagers looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow larger, stretching toward them, their shapes becoming clearer. They looked almost like figures, tall men and women, their outlines sharp and defined. One of the figures, a tall man in an old-fashioned suit, stepped forward, his face obscured by the darkness, but his presence undeniable. The girl screamed, but the sound was lost in the overwhelming silence that followed. The boy grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, but as they turned, they were stopped dead in their tracks by a loud crash from the direction of the staircase. A portrait, one that had been hanging undisturbed for years, had fallen from its place, shattering on the floor below. The glass glinted in the pale light, and for a fleeting moment, they could see the image, a woman, her eyes wide and hauntingly alive, staring directly at them. Without another word, they bolted for the door, but just as they reached it, the air around them seemed to shift. The temperature plummeted, and the sound of distant, rhythmic footsteps echoed through the house. It was as though something or someone was following them, getting closer with every step they took. The girl turned, terrified, and saw the figure in the suit again. This time, his face was clearer, his features sharp but ancient. His eyes were dark, empty pits, staring into her soul. She gasped, backing away, but the door wouldn't budge. It had jammed, as if someone or something was keeping them inside. The whispers swirled around them now, louder and more insistent. "You should never have come," the voice murmured, the words thick with contempt. "Leave, and never return." In a panic, the boy tried one last time to open the door, his hands shaking violently. But then, in the next moment, the whispers stopped, as if the house itself had fallen silent. For a brief instant, everything was still, and they heard nothing but their own ragged breathing. And then, a new sound emerged, soft at first, but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, approaching from the hallway behind them. They turned, their hearts pounding in their chests, and saw the figure once more. But this time, it wasn't alone. Figures appeared behind him, men and women, all dressed in clothing from a bygone era, their faces pale and expressionless. They didn't move. They just stood there, their cold, empty eyes fixed on the teenagers. "Leave now," the first figure spoke again, his voice low and almost pleading. "Or you will join us." The door suddenly flew open, as if a force had wrenched it free. The teenagers didn't hesitate for a second. They rushed through the threshold and into the night, but even as they fled down the path toward the street, they could hear the whispers fading into the distance, calling after them, echoing through the trees, "You're not safe, not safe." In the days that followed, the couple couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The shadows seemed to cling to them wherever they went. And when they spoke to others about their experience, they were met with a strange, almost knowing look from the townspeople. "They warned you," one elderly local said, her voice filled with quiet gravity. "Once the house lets you in, it doesn't let go. You're part of it now." Soon after, the mansion fell quiet again. But that did nothing to ease the growing unease in the town. People began to hear the whispers even outside the house, drifting through the trees, lingering in the night air. And the shadows, it seemed, were no longer confined to the walls of the mansion. They had begun to spread, following those who had dared to enter, slowly enveloping the town in a growing, impenetrable darkness. The mansion had not finished with them yet. The question lingered, growing more urgent with each passing day. What was it that Anthony Quinn had stirred within those walls? And what had come to life in the mansion, waiting all these years for someone to open the door? Months passed, and the mansion's hold on Providence seemed to deepen. The shadows grew longer, darker, and even the bravest of the locals found themselves avoiding the area near Anthony Quinn's mansion. The once grand house now stood as a looming, silent monument to something ancient and unknowable, its secrets locked behind thick stone walls and layers of history. But for those who had ventured too close, the whispers didn't stop. They followed them everywhere. The couple who had entered the mansion that fateful night found their lives slowly unraveling. The girl, unable to shake the image of the haunting figure with the soulless eyes, began to suffer from nightmares so vivid that they bled into her waking hours. She would see those shadowy figures in every reflection, every window, every dark corner. And the whispers, they had become a constant presence, faint at first, then louder, as if they were speaking directly into her ear. The boy, too, was not immune. His dreams were plagued by the sound of footsteps, always behind him, always just out of reach. And when he turned, the faces of the figures in the mansion would be staring back at him. The whispers spoke his name now, following him wherever he went, growing louder with each passing day. "Join us, join us." As the weeks passed, they began to notice strange things happening around them. Objects moving on their own, lights flickering in their home when there was no reason for them to. One evening, as they sat in the living room, they saw something that sent them into a frenzy. Standing in the doorway was the tall man in the suit, his face still shrouded in darkness. His lips moved, though no sound came from them. He was saying something that only they could hear. Without warning, the room grew cold, colder than it had ever been. Their breath was visible in the air, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, reaching out toward them. The boy jumped to his feet, grabbing the girl by the hand, and they rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. It felt as though something, or someone, was holding it shut. The figure in the doorway stepped closer, and this time his face became clearer. His eyes, hollow and empty, stared directly into the girl's soul, and the whisper came once more, but this time, it was a roar in her mind. "It's time to come home." Panicking, they finally managed to break free from the house. The night was thick with fog, and the streets seemed eerily empty as they ran. They didn't stop until they reached the town, but by then, it was already too late. The whispers had already begun to spread. The next morning, the girl was missing. The boy searched everywhere, retracing their steps from the night before, but there was no sign of her. The house, he knew, had taken her, just as it had promised. And the whispers were louder now, following him even as he stood in the streets, chilling him to his core. It was then that he learned the truth. Local historians and the few remaining townsfolk who still dared to speak of it revealed the mansion's dark history, long before Anthony Quinn had ever stepped foot inside. The house had once belonged to a wealthy couple who had disappeared mysteriously one night. The couple's servants claimed to have heard strange noises in the walls, whispers in a language no one could understand. It was rumored that the couple had made a deal with something ancient, something tied to the land, something that demanded a price. The mansion had become a prison for those who entered, and over the years, it had claimed many souls, drawing them in with whispers and shadows until they became part of the house itself. And now, with Quinn's arrival, the mansion had awakened once more, hungrier than ever. The boy, consumed by grief and guilt, returned to the mansion, determined to find her and break whatever curse had ensnared them both. He stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop instantly. The air was thick, heavy, and the shadows seemed to press in on him from all sides. But as he made his way deeper into the house, he felt the whispers growing louder, almost deafening now. They surrounded him, pulling at his mind, urging him forward. He found himself drawn to the library, the same room where the portrait of the woman had once fallen. There, in the center of the room, was a mirror, a tall, ornate piece that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. He approached it slowly, and as he gazed into its surface, his reflection began to shift. Instead of seeing himself, he saw the girl trapped, her eyes wide with terror, calling out to him. The room around her was filled with shadows, all pressing in on her. And then, just as he reached out to touch the mirror, the glass rippled, distorting, and the figure of the girl vanished, replaced by the man in the suit. He stepped back, heart racing, and the whispers grew more frantic, more insistent. "You must join us," they chanted, swirling around him, pushing him toward the mirror. He could feel his strength leaving him, as though the house itself was feeding off his fear, draining him of his will to fight. In that moment, he understood. The house didn't just take souls, it consumed them, trapping them in an endless cycle, feeding off their life force to keep the darkness alive. He wasn't just fighting to save the girl, he was fighting for his very soul. But it was already too late. The last thing he felt before the shadows closed in around him was a cold hand on his shoulder. And the whisper, now clearer than ever, "Welcome home." And with that, the mansion stood silent once again, its windows dark and lifeless, as though nothing had ever happened. But if you listen closely, late at night, you might hear the whispers still faint, distant, calling out to anyone brave enough to approach. Join us, join us. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.